Good evening, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 114th season of the Empire Club of Canada, and welcome to the Albany Club. My name is Barbara Jess, and I'm the president of the Empire Club of Canada and your host for this evening's event discussing the Ontario post-election political landscape. I have some mixed feelings in saying that I'm in the final hours of my presidency. Tomorrow will be our final lunch, and this is our final evening event. And I'd like to take a moment just to thank the Evening Events Committee, chaired by Megan Boyle. She's not with us, she's come down with the flu, but I know Tim Smitherman is here, and I'm so grateful for how actively you've pursued these evening events, so I want to thank the committee very sincerely. And I also would like to take the occasion to introduce to you the incoming president of the Empire Club for the 2018-2019 season. He's with us somewhere in the back. I saw him, Kent Emerson. Welcome, Kent, and I hope that you have the benefit of enjoying your year as much as I've enjoyed mine. It's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. Before we get started, I'd like to draw for our door prize, which is a bottle of Rapazzo Bozan, sponsored by Cesari Fine Wines of Verona. And it is Fardus Husseini. Have I got that right? Fardus Husseini? Thanks. Given voter volatility in elections and voting and voting around the world in recent years, our guests tonight clearly have nerves of steel. How else to explain anyone putting their careers on the line for a campaign? The polls just don't seem to be giving campaigns the data they need to develop key strategies, but something obviously went right this time. How is it that polls have become so volatile? Explanations from sampling error percentage, inadequacies of survey modes, timing, field procedures. Polls don't predict, they measure the moment. Weighting and determining probable voters, all playing into the kinds of disparity we see so often today. Then, of course, we've also observed some very nefarious dealings in the use of big data. The rise of populism as an emotional response has also stymied strategists as it emerges on both the left and the right, defying logic and, let's face it, quite often the facts. Then there is the staggering mistrust of mainstream media in some sectors and the bewildering faith in citizen journalism wherever it appears on the internet. So how do we understand the dynamics of the recent election here in Ontario, and what can we look for in the months ahead? Here to help us sort through all of this is our panel of experts. Omar Khan is the Vice President, Public Affairs, Hill and Knowlton. He is VP Engagement for the 2018 Ontario Liberal Party and served on the Central Campaign Steering Committee. Omar has spent over a decade working at the highest levels of the Ontario government, as well as federal and provincial election campaigns. Michael Diamond is a campaign strategist and political commentator. He has worked on over 20 political campaigns in 5 provinces. A specialist in grassroots engagement, Michael has helped leverage the power of stakeholders for well-known clients in Canada, the United States, and in Australia. Brian Topp is a partner at KTG Public Affairs. He recently completed a 2-year stint as the Chief of Staff to Alberta Premier Rachel Notley, who's been a guest at our podium on 2 occasions. He previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Saskatchewan Premier Roy Romanow. David Coletto is CEO and a founding partner of Abacus Data, a full-service market research firm based in Ottawa. With over 12 years' experience in the industry, David advises some of Canada's leading corporations and associations. Our moderator, Tom Clark, is Chairman Global Public Affairs. He has had more than 45 years' experience at the most senior levels of Canadian journalism. Tom left Global News in January of 2017 after serving as the network's chief political correspondent and host of the West Block. He has interviewed every Canadian Prime Minister since Lester B. Pearson and has covered every federal election campaign since 1974. I'd like to invite David Coletto to the podium to lead things off with a brief presentation, and then we'll have our panel discussion. David?
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you, everyone. Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. I will say, for those of you who don't know me or haven't seen a picture of me before, I am old enough to vote in Ontario. I just credit my Italian heritage and all the olive oil for this youthful glow. But this is thank you. This is the third Ontario election that I had the I'm not sure if it's always the pleasure of trying to understand and look at what Ontario voters are thinking and how they're thinking and why they're thinking. And as Barbara mentioned, polling has come under the microscope far too often these days. But I can say happily this was a good election for my colleagues in the industry. What I'm going to do today is very briefly go over what I saw in this election from a public opinion perspective, and then I'll hand it off to the panel to dissect it and explain why I'm completely wrong with everything I've said. So let's start with 5 data points that I think nicely sums up what the election that we saw. And let's start with the horse race. And if we go to the end of April, we saw, as many people really thought, was going to be a pretty easy victory for the Progressive Conservatives and Doug Ford. He entered the election well ahead. The Liberals were in second, the New Democrats not too far behind in third place. And you can see, as we all know, by the end, it got a little bit dicey, a little bit competitive. But in the end, the Tories slightly outperformed the polls, got just over 40% of the vote. The NDP ended at 34, and the Liberals in third with 7 seats and losing their official party status, right? So that's the story. So what was this election about? Well, obviously it was about change. And this is a trend line from the start of the election to the end, showing the percentage of Ontarians who wanted change when we asked them in our surveys, going from 80% at the beginning to 84% at the end. So one of the marked areas of continuity over this campaign was the level of certainty, at what we almost term determination of Ontarians to change their government. That did not change over the course of the campaign. Now, the campaign did matter, right? Even though Mr. Ford ended off very similar to where he started the campaign in terms of popular vote, we did see some change. One of those being his own personal numbers. We saw a rise in Mr. Ford's negatives, going from 35% at the beginning to 48% at the end. Ms. Horvath also had a good campaign. She didn't win, but she started the campaign, despite this being her third campaign, with almost 1 out of 5 Ontarians saying, I don't know anything about her. I don't know who she is. And at the end, more than 2-to-1 margin, people liked her than disliked her. So despite not winning this election, she ended off far more popular personally than Mr. Ford did overall. And this momentum that we saw for the New Democrats in the midway point of the campaign was also reflected when you asked voters, who do you think is going to win? And at the beginning of the campaign, most people thought, or at least those who had a sense of what was going to happen, felt confident that the Tories were going to win the election. And you can see by a week before the vote, it was pretty much a dead heat, with equal numbers saying Conservative, NDP, or I have no idea what's going to happen. Now, for us, one of the interesting measures we continued to track over the campaign was when you asked voters, how would you respond to different outcomes? And so when we asked people, for example, how would you feel if the Liberals and Kathleen Wynne won re-election? You can see there at the end of the campaign, 52% of Ontarians said they would be dismayed if she would win, right? So there's a reflection of this desire for change. Now, on the flip side, despite the sort of rising discussion about whether we should be scared of an NDP government or not, you can see that only 1 out of 3, 31%, were actually dismayed with the idea of a New Democrat government. So there wasn't a lot of fear about the New Democrats. The other thing that's going to surprise many of you, depending on what your political persuasion are, is that I think the reason the Tories held off the sort of orange tide that was building was that despite more people fearing a PC win than an NDP win, not enough people feared a Doug Ford victory. And as a result, they were able to push back any final attempts at strategic voting, and perhaps Premier Wynne or Kathleen Wynne's attempt at trying to get some local candidates elected may have helped. I'll let the panelists talk about that in a moment. So this was a change election. PCs held and mobilized their support clearly throughout this campaign, and NDP momentum stalled, but I think they executed a good campaign. So then, let's talk a little bit about what happened. And so what we did is, earlier last week, we went back into the field and we asked people who voted why they voted, when they made up their mind, what were the key issues, and perhaps more important to the future, what do they want this new government to do? And so let me share some of those results for you. The first thing is when we ask people, give us a word to describe how you feel about the election. And there's a lot of words I had to remove. But by and large, and again, this theme will come up, this word cloud is not as negative as you might expect it to be given some of the media coverage of this election, right? There's a large disappointed, but there is no great fear, there is no great angst about Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives. In fact, you see a lot of large words, and the larger the word, the more often, hope, happy, great, good, right? And so when you ask people, okay, prompted, how do you respond to this election? You can see 56% are either happy or accepting of this result, right? And that, again, might surprise many people. Only 17% say they're angry at or upset with the result. Now, when we look at the map, this is hard to see for all of you, but what's clear is that this election win by the Tories was geographically broad, from one end of the province to the other, a large blue belt, right, across the more rural parts of the province, except up in the north. You can look here in the Greater Toronto area, lots of blue. So they won in cities, they won in suburban communities, and they won in rural parts of the province. They also did fairly well among every age group. One of the things that we were talking a lot about at Abacus was the millennial vote. Would it show up? Would it have an impact on the result? And at the end of the day, turnout went up, perhaps not as enough to give the New Democrats a boost, but you can see that the Conservative win was pretty much lifted by the fact they did so well among older men. And the flip was true for the New Democrats, who won by over 11 points among women under the age of 45. These two demographic cohorts were critical to both of their parties' ultimate success. The fact that older people are more likely to vote helped, I think, push the Conservative numbers forward. Similarly, around home ownership, this was an election where on the periphery, people were talking about affordability, and housing affordability is a top issue for a lot of voters across the province. You can see among owners, the Tories won by over double digits. Among renters, the same thing for the New Democrats. So increasingly becoming, as we are seeing in, for example, British Columbia and other provinces, the difference between those who own and those who rent being key drivers in their voting behavior. Now, perhaps most fascinating to me was us pollsters and social scientists like asking party identification. Which party do you identify with, not who you're going to vote for? And you can see among those who identify as Conservative, almost all of them voted PC. Almost all of those who identified as New Democrat voted New Democrat. But look among those who identify as Liberal. Half of them did not vote for the Liberal Party. And when I come back to the end, and I'm going to give Omar a little bit of hope for the future, right? This is still more a Liberal province than it is a New Democrat province. And there's shades of the federal election after 2015. Now, when did voters make up their minds? One of the key things that perhaps was underreported throughout the campaign was that 2/3 of PC voters had made up their mind well before this election started and were not going to change their mind. They had almost 30% of this election baked in from day one. But among those who made up their mind in the last few weeks of the campaign, you can see how successful the New Democrats did among that group. In the last few days, the Liberals actually got a little boost. Again, was that the Hail Mary pass from the Premier at the time? We'll see. But you can see that the Tories didn't have to do much except hold their vote throughout this campaign, get them out to vote on Election Day, and they could probably have won this election. Another thing I want to address, and I only have a few minutes, so I can't go deep here. If I had hours, I would. Was this a populist uprising? Was this Trump 2.0? Has Ontario gone the way of the United States? And I look at the data, and my answer is, I don't think so. And so here's why. If you look at one of the key drivers of understanding populist movements is education increasingly becoming a key wedge in how people vote. In the Ontario election, as many of those who had a university degree voted Conservative as those who had only high school or college. This was not an election that was clearly divided on how much money you make or on what your level of education is. Okay, so we can write that demographic trend off. When you look at feelings about anxiety around economics, PC voters were actually more likely to say they were financially secure than those who voted NDP. This was not, again, a lot of voters who somehow felt the system was letting them down or they were being left behind by a system moving forward. And one of the measures that those who try to measure populist movements look at is, do you feel you have less power, that you're losing power in society? PC voters were just as likely to say no to that question as New Democrat voters. Now, there are some important differences. We asked people, for example, is political correctness out of control? That blue line are progressive conservative voters. Yeah, 72% of them say yes, but so did 54% of those who voted Liberal and NDP. 57% of progressive conservatives say Canada's diversity is making Canada something they no longer recognize, but so does almost a third of those who didn't vote PC. All of this tells me is that we didn't see this new coalition of populism rear its head in this election. What you had was those who had always voted Conservative coming out, and an additional 5 or 6 points coming who, at the end of the day, quite frankly, wanted a tax cut and they wanted to kick the Premier out. And that, I think, is what was going on here. So this, I don't believe, and the data still needs to be analyzed a little bit more, wasn't, as some of my colleagues suggest, an uprising of populism in this province. It simply was the calculus of the PC base voting with a suburban and urban, older, wealthier population looking for change and, again, a little bit more affordability in their day-to-day lives. So let me wrap up with then, how does the Premier then, and the new Premier designate, deliver for the people? And so when you ask people, again, open-ended, what do you want? What would be the most important thing you want coming from this government? You can see what they want, right? It's pretty clear. There's gas prices in there, housing, hydro rates, debt, right? Deficit, jobs. Basically, you can see the Tory agenda in this word cloud. If you ask people, what are you worried most about from this government? You see almost the same things, right? You see the framing that I think effectively the opposition parties did is people are concerned about healthcare. But if I go back here, healthcare does also show up, where is it? Somewhere on here, I saw it on something that people think the new government will be able to help with. Higher debt. There was a stream of consciousness in this data about people feeling that the PCs couldn't deliver on their platform, right? That it wasn't costed or it was too expensive. And there is some concern about that. That did appear in our data. Now, when we asked some of the things that the PCs promised over the election, and we asked people, do you want them to follow through with this? Look what's at the top. 73% of Ontarians said, yes, cut my gas tax by 10 cents, including 86% of those who voted Progressive Conservative. Audit the finances, pretty easy one to say yes to, 63% across the province, 80% of PC. Fire that CEO at Hydro One, right? Which you would think is only red meat for the base. No, that's red meat for half of Ontarians who said that, including 76% of the PC voters. Now, I won't go through the whole list. You can see the buck of beer wasn't as popular as maybe we had hoped. But look, eliminate, and I spelt eliminate wrong there, cap and trade, right? 68%, that's something that over-indexed for PC supporters, but almost half of Ontarians. Remember, not all of these, there are people who did not vote PC who also support or want the government to follow through with getting rid of cap and trade, right? And this is this challenge we see in constant data we do. On the one hand, people say, you know, climate change is an issue we need to deal with, but on the other hand, they then also support this. So let me wrap up then by saying what's happening with the other two parties. First of all, it's clear the NDP had a good election, right? They went from third to second. There were times when they were competitive in at least the polling that we saw. And perhaps most important to me, and they think about the next 4 years, is the fact that 64% of Ontarians at the end of the campaign said they were open to voting New Democrat, 20 points higher than any other party. So while the campaign maybe didn't close the deal, it did have an effect of increasing, at least for a moment, the number of people who said, maybe I would vote NDP. And in this province, given the fact that when Bob Rae was elected, I was 11, it's been something that the parties had to come over. I think they can probably walk away now and say, perhaps that ghost is past. Lastly, what do the Liberals do? And one of the fascinating things, as I already alluded to in the data, is 28% of Ontarians, when you ask them in our post-election survey, still identify as Liberal. And as I said, half of those did not vote for the Liberal Party. So they are basically, in terms of base voters, almost the same, have the same number as the Progressive Conservatives. And so when you think of Kathleen Wynne, right, only 17% of Ontarians had a positive impression of her. 28% identify as Liberal, and even at the very worst, the bottoming out of this party, 40% of Ontarians still said at some point they'd be open to voting Liberal. I highlight Michael Ignatieff in the corner there, if you can't tell who that is. It is the ghost of Ignatieff, who will remind us all that in 2011, that fateful night, when we were counting the votes and Mr. Top's party came from third, almost to first, but at least into the official opposition, people were writing off the Liberals, saying this is now a two-party system, forget them, they're gone. Well, guess what? We know the answer to that. In 4 years, we had a Liberal majority government. So, in conclusion, the data suggests to me this was a broad-based PC majority. This wasn't a minority of voters. Well, it was a minority of voters, but it wasn't a special pocket of voters that came out and overwhelmed the others. This was broad-based. Yes, they did better among older voters than younger, but not by as large margins as we've seen in other elections. Most of this PC agenda, at least the high-profile stuff, was quite popular. So the Premier, despite getting flack from his opponents and the opposition, will feel, I think, comfortable moving forward with much of the things that he promised, or the new Premier, by the way, he promised to do. Concerns over the course of the campaign about Mr. Ford increased, but I think the end of the day was this campaign was not long enough, and perhaps the opposition parties didn't have enough money or resources or effectiveness to change enough minds, and as a result, we have a PC majority, an NDP opposition, and a Liberal Party asking itself, what next? Tom?
Terrific. David said he's old enough to vote, but the organizers said he had to go first because bedtime, you know. So as you heard, I've seen one or two elections, but my conclusion after years of covering these things is that you're always best to have a debrief on a campaign and election more than 2 weeks after the event. Because from after the event until 2 weeks, everybody's still very nice. You know, oh, you ran a fine campaign. Yes, you good fellow, public service. 2 weeks is the mark where everybody says, okay, I'm going to tell you what I really think now. So we're at that stage. And the lovely thing is, to this terrific panel who's here, that David, as much as you are truly an expert in this area, we are not restricted by facts. We argue in an entirely different universe than you do. Election campaigns, in the end, are all about winning and losing. You know, we like to pretend otherwise, but the simple reality is you win, you lose. That's how it is for the next 4 years. So I want to start with Brian Topp. You know, Brian, we saw all those numbers and those trend lines that David showed us. It was up, 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 and at one point you were not only up, but you were it. So did you win or did you lose?
Well, I'll begin answering that question by saying the first election I ever worked on was in a by-election in the riding of Saint-Jacques at East End, Montreal. And was in the mid-1980s. I was 2 years old. And I was 50% of the outreach team. And when it was all over, we got together in our little campaign office on Ontario Street. And we had a fabulous party. And we sang and we danced and we were there all night, very, very happy. We had increased the NDP vote by 100%. We had gone from 1% to 2%. So I offer that too as a reasonable baseline for every campaign. And compared to that, this was fabulous. So look, I mean, my esteemed friend here is now going to get to live this. Third parties always begin elections by asking themselves, Ontario Liberals are never to be underestimated, I have learned over the years. You always start when you're the third party by asking, are we going to survive?
Right.
And, that was, the Ontario NDP went through some tough times after the last election. There was a tough internal debate about the campaign. People were unhappy with the campaign, with its tone, with its results. And there was a debate in the tribe in which basically people said, win or lose, we're going to run as ourselves. And the result was a much happier, more relaxed Andrea Horwath, who was campaigning on what she really believed on. And then we had the following piece of good fortune. The government, mindful, as no doubt we were as well, that the most accessible next tranche of voters for the Democrats were Liberals, who we just saw in the numbers, helpfully validated our platform with their throne speech and budget. So basically the government, in effect, said, everything Andrea wants to run on, we agree with too, and it's good. Now, I think what they were hoping to do was to hold off her growth and to appropriate her vote. But I think in this case, in this election, the result was the opposite. Since Liberals were having a hard time distinguishing between what the New Democrats were offering and what the Liberals were offering, and since this government had that experience that Alan Blakeney used to talk about of 15 years in office with a handful of sand dropped on your back every day, inevitably the years tell, essentially the Liberals convinced their own voters to give the New Democrats a look. And so to that point, yes, we were winning. And then you were at the magic point in the campaign, 2/3 of the way into it, where the party needed to persuade about 5 more points to do something they had never done before, which was to vote for the Democrats and to make Andrea Horwath the premier. And there we didn't close the sale, as was said earlier, because what was working for us then started to tell against us. People were having a hard time telling the difference between these two parties. And people had made a decision, 80% had made a decision, we want change. So the change thing that had been working for us in our world made it tougher to get that last 5. And so the result was, look, compared to Saint Jacques, 1985, it was fabulous. And another major opportunity has been handed to the Democrats that they last saw with that federal result that you just teased me about in 2011, which is a chance to be taken seriously for government next time. And the story that tells, which is 3 years about Senator Duffy does not make you prime minister, right? We're going to have to learn. And so the business of both being an effective official opposition and as well campaigning in the province, defeating the government and replacing it is something we're going to have to do a better job of. It was, if not a win, it wasn't bad.
Oh, it reminds me of what Stephen Lewis said when the NDP were first elected official opposition in this province. And he said, thank God, a political victory instead of another damn moral victory. And I think that's probably where you are. So we know between Omar and Michael, I mean, you won, you lost. There's no sort of nuance in there. But Omar, I want to know, and you could be honest, just between you and me.
And a few of our
friends.
When did you absolutely know that this was going to be a monumental loss?
So I personally thought going into the campaign that victory was unlikely. I thought there was a small glimmer of hope, but it was unlikely. We would have had to pull off a feat unheard of in modern political history, which was win an election when 80 to 90% of the electorate, as David pointed out, have a strong desire for change. So the strategy going in was to consolidate the progressive vote around the Liberal choice. I'll be honest with the room here, the senior team knew that there was a risk in us going so hard after Mr. Ford pre-writ that a lot of progressive voters would be scared off, and some soft PC voters would be scared off, jump over us and over to the NDP. But it was a calculated risk that the team felt was it was something that at that point had to be taken, and that's exactly what happened in the early stages. You saw, I think, as a result of the aggressive Liberal pre-writ ad buy combined with Andrea's fairly good performance in the first City TV debate, you saw the beginnings of a momentum shift towards the NDP. When did we know that it was done for sure? Yeah.
There was a lot of conversations preceding the Premier's concession. I thought I'm going back like a year.
Wow.
What year did you know you were done?
So let me go back a little bit. Chris Morley is here, former Chief of Staff to Premier McGuinty. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about the legacy of both Premiers McGuinty and Wynne, if you'll allow me that.
Well,
and then I'll answer your question.
Yeah, but
Deal?
like the campaign over.
No, fair enough.
It's fair enough. You want to talk about the legacy.
The legacy of 7 seats.
But
touche.
Omar, you'll find another way into that in a minute, I'm sure. And I don't mean to deny any party. Look,
it's the third party. We get some speaking time.
Honestly, Omar, if you were an official political party, I'd let you do it. But
so let me say this. You touched upon this a little bit earlier. So after 15 years in government. And governing is not easy. It is hard. There's an accumulated weight to some of the decisions you take. So the reason I pointed out to Chris Morley earlier was I'll take the decision of Dalton McGuinty, of Premier McGuinty, to move towards a harmonized combined sales tax, the HST, which at the time everyone thought it was political suicide. No government in Canadian history had been re-elected after moving to implement a harmonized sales tax. Premier McGuinty did that because it was the right thing to do, because it was the business community was asking for at a time coming directly after the 2008 worldwide economic recession. And by the way, it was a policy that the Progressive Conservatives had pushed until the Liberals decided to do it. But those decisions, not all of them are always popular. And when you make a series of decisions like that and others over the course of 15 years, that does accumulate a lot of baggage. I'm not one of the Liberals who's going to say that being in power for 15 years is the sole reason we're at 7 seats. I think it's probably the reason we lost government. I don't actually think it's the sole reason why we did as badly as we did. I think, and I've said this before publicly, I'll say it again here tonight, I think Ontario Liberals over the next days, weeks, and months need to do a little bit of soul searching. I think we need to look ourselves in the mirror and realize, where did we actually lose the trust of Ontarians? Because it's clear we did lose the trust of Ontarians at some point over the last 4 years. And that's, I think as we begin the process of rebuilding, that's going to be a critical internal discussion that we in the party are going to have.
And we're going to get into that. And I just point out, for those who say, well, any government that's been in power for 10 years or 15 years inevitably is going to fall off the stage. I don't know if you've ever met Bill Davis. Tories were around for 42 years.
Or Peter Lougheed.
Or Peter Lougheed, for that matter. Okay. So now you can take your rightful position in all of this.
We generally get to write history.
Yeah, well, that's right, yeah. When you look back at this campaign, and I know this is a non-political crowd, but, they may be interested in this. I want to delve into, I was going to ask you, what was the one unexpected thing that happened in the campaign? I think I know the answer to that. But in case I'm wrong, like conceding the election 10 days before the vote, which was kind of an unusual thing to do. But I do want to talk about that in general terms for all parties, because it was one of the newest Hail Mary passes I've ever seen. But in terms of the campaign itself, you knew you were going to win walking in. You knew also, as David's numbers show, that you had a bit of a hot potato on your hands. The negatives for Doug Ford were fairly high and kept on growing during the campaign. Somebody did suggest that maybe what you should have done in the campaign is sent Doug on an all-inclusive trip down to Mexico for the campaign, and he would have won anyway. I mean, how did that work, and what was the one unexpected moment that you had?
Look, the single most unexpected thing for me in this campaign was that Patrick Brown was not leader and Doug Ford was. And it became the most wild political campaign that I've been involved in from that moment onward. So, I mean, everything was unexpected, not any one single part of this. But, I think that was a place where, for Omar's party especially, that was a big problem. A lot of your friends in third-party movements spent a lot of time investing in how to destroy Patrick Brown, who all of a sudden wasn't someone worth destroying. He did a good job of that with the help of CTV all on his own. So you wasted a lot of time and a lot of treasure on something that never mattered. And that's where one place we definitely had a head start compared to Tim Hudak. There was just not the months of destruction thrown at us. So, I mean, that was the surprise that I think really shaped the election.
And can we just, I mean, you're absolutely, I mean, you know, when the history of this election is finally written, it starts with that night when Patrick Brown ran down the hallway. But
it was a staircase.
Or the stairway or whatever. Which is a great way to start a campaign. But in the confines of the campaign itself, and Brian and Omar, jump in on this, let's just kick it around a little bit. This idea that when you know that you're going down to defeat, when basically you're trying to save the furniture, you have been government for 15 years, and you say, you know what, I got a great idea. Let's say we've lost, even before the campaign is over. There were some people who were suggesting that maybe she should have said, elect me and I'll quit, which would have been an equally interesting Hail Mary pass. Did it work?
I would have liked one more seat. So, look, this is a question that political scientists are going to debate for years and decades to come. I'll quote Michael's colleague, Corey Tonick, who was on a panel with me at our firm a few days ago. Corey said that they had us tracking to 1 before that announcement and probably saved us about 6 seats. I can tell you here, by that point, we had actually stopped most of our polling within the Liberal Party, but we were very worried we were tracking to 0.
If you look at the Liberals who won, I think it absolutely paid dividends. The folks like Michael Coletto, Mitzi Hunter, Michael Gravel, who are definitely stronger local MPPs than a lot of the folks in some of the safer ridings that lost. So I think without a doubt that proves to me that it won. It was still, or that it worked. It was still an awful situation that was unprecedented, and I don't think we'll see again.
I'll also say I think it was a bit of a selfish act on behalf of the Premier. Look, you know. Whatever
I told you about that 2-week rule.
Whatever you think of the policies of Premier Wynne, no one can argue that that was an easy thing to do.
It was selfish to seek re-election, frankly.
I want to be nonpartisan.
I want to get Brian in on this. Would you have advised that, Brian?
So look, we're past the 2 weeks.
Yeah, we are. So the voters, in fact, were wrong, and
I will say, look. The McGuinty government and Premier Wynne had their moments, right? I want to say that up front. History will be kinder to them than this election was. That said, I think, look, Premier Wynne, I think, made 2 big mistakes in her premiership. The first was the privatization of Hydro One, which blew their brains out. And my argument was that was where the election was lost by the Liberals. And then I strongly believe that these moves of overthinking elections and of conceding them always have the result that this one had. So look, let me refer to New Democrats. So when you have decided in much of this country that you're going to vote for the NDP, you have made a decision contrary to most of the observable evidence around you. So you have decided to ignore political polling. You have decided to ignore what your mom thinks. You have decided, I don't care what all the signs are around in my neighborhood. I've decided I want this party to run. And I spent a fair bit of money once trying to prove this to my colleagues in the tribe. That when people make that decision, they actually want us to be the government. So if that's true, then they don't care about the polls. They don't care about the other parties. They don't care about the media. They don't care about their neighbors. They don't care about mom. They've decided to vote NDP. And there's only one group that can persuade you not to vote for the NDP, and that's the NDP. If the party says we can't win, then you are telling your voters you might as well look somebody else for where the government is, and most people are looking for the government. And these polling numbers, which show that half the Liberal vote voted elsewhere, would suggest this was a disastrous technique. And if I can be blunt about it, and here I'll just talk about the principle of it, I think it's disrespectful of the voters to play games like that with the elections. What you owe them, and I offered this to you as a bit of counsel in this fun spot of being the third party.
Not a party yet.
Is your best shot. Like, give it your best shot. Try. Give it everything you can. Talk passionately, right? Be just to the last minute. God bless his soul. Bob Ray, who's one of yours. at the end of his term, never gave up. He just argued and argued and argued and argued to the last minute that Premier Harris would be wrong for the province, in which, in my view, he was right. And he saved 18 seats and got the best electoral result that the Democrat was to have until this election.
Like
don't
I said,
give up.
This is going to be debated by political scientists and pundits for years.
Let's debate it now.
We are where we are, right? So you know, it was a decision that was made. Some folks were in favor of it, some folks were against it. At the end of the day, it was the Premier's decision. And that was the decision. This is where we are. As Liberals now, we have to think about where do we go from here. I think, obviously, we have to look at decisions of the past, and there needs to be accountability for decisions that were wrong, and there needs to be congratulations for decisions that were right. But I really think the focus of our party needs to be on the future, moving to a new generation of leaders, both within the party, within the caucus, attracting new people into the party. This notion that the Liberal Party is dead is ludicrous. We have tens of thousands of members across this province. We got over 1 million votes in this election. And quite frankly, with all due respect to Brian and his party, if the NDP can't win this election, where the Ontario Liberals were at a historic low, below 1923, okay, in terms of the popular vote, if they could not win this election with Doug Ford as leader with such high negatives, what election are they going to win?
The next one.
And
we'll see.
So, you know, if we can talk,
we'll see. We'll see. If you couldn't win this one, I'm not holding my breath.
Well, Brian and Omar have been debating the merits of third-party politics.
we're governing.
Michael's sitting here going, yeah, whatever. Yeah.
If I can just touch on, if I can just touch on some of the mistakes Kathleen Wynne made in the movie Traffic.
We spent too much on pizza.
Which is, I'm going to talk now. You have to ask Brian and I before you ask questions. In the movie Traffic, there's a scene where Michael Douglas is becoming the drug czar, and his predecessor gives him 2 envelopes, and he says, "You open this one when you hit your first scandal, and you open this one when you hit your second scandal." So you hit the first scandal, and you open up the envelope, and it says, "Blame me for everything." And Kathleen Wynne did a great job of blaming Dalton McGuinty before the 2014 for absolutely everything. Then she won. The problem is she didn't open up that second envelope, which said, "Resign."
Well, I mean, it is a good question. You know, politicians traditionally, no matter what party they're in, tend to overstay their welcome, and that more often than not writes the script for various elections.
We can destroy the party.
Look, the results would indicate that perhaps you know, a different decision in the run up to the election would have been better. But hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah.
Look, of course, we're at 7 seats. Could somebody have done better? Probably. But you never know until you go through the process. This is why I think, you know, this is, you know, for all the Liberals in the room, I would say it's not a very productive conversation at this point.
You do know this is the Albany Club, right?
There's a few. I see a few hiding in the back.
Membership forms are on the front desk.
But you know, rehashing, should she have left? Well, you know, could we have won with somebody else? It's not a very productive conversation right now because we are at 7 seats. We're going to need every volunteer, you know, the tens of thousands of our grassroots to be engaged, but looking forward. And that's what I would urge my fellow Liberals is, you know, we can argue about the past over drinks at the pool. You know, Michael Diamond and I do that sometimes. But, you know, the productive conversation now is what do we do moving forward? We need to redefine liberalism in a way that is relevant for Ontarians in the modern world. That's something that Mr. Ford was actually very good at. You know, I don't agree with the vast majority of his policies, but he explained them in ways that made it seem relevant to everyday people. We as Ontario Liberals lost the middle class in this election. Absolutely, across the board, in every region, we lost the middle class.
15 years of a war on them, it seems to make sense.
You have 4 years, Doc. We used to be the party for the little guy. Jean Chrétien was the little guy from Shawinigan. We lost the little guy. We have to win the little guy back moving forward.
Michael, let me throw it to you for a while. And I don't want to get into policy so much as I want to keep on the political track on this. You walked into this campaign with a leader that had very few connections in the party, with a policy that sort of reflected what Patrick Brown had, but at the same time didn't.
There was some distinct, huge.
Yeah, and by some measures, he promised as much as $40 billion and cutting revenues, which will be a really interesting trick. So how do you manage politically? You know, it's like the old story about the dog finally catches the car and says, "Now what do I do?" you've got to manage disappointment now for a while in terms of, and you go back to David's numbers, what promises do even conservatives want Doug Ford to keep? It's not 100%.
Look, I mean, a buck of beer is free, but apparently it's not all that popular. I'm a little disappointed to see that.
Have you tried bucket beer?
Yeah.
I don't drink beer, but look, the platform obviously came together in an unusual way. We didn't have the year plus that a typical leader would have to put together the platform they want. So what was very important for us during the leadership and during the provincial election, and since we weren't attacked on it, I think the other parties thought it would have been foolish, was getting out of cap and trade and fighting a carbon tax. I mean, that was obviously key to us. We also know that the province is in more of a mess than we can even anticipate. So one of the key promises was the committee of inquiry to actually get to the bottom of just how much waste and mismanagement has gone on for the last 15 years. So I think it's going to take time. Our platform was a lot of our promises are very achievable quickly. Some are longer term goals, not stretch goals like Kathleen Wynne ran on in 2014, but they're things that I think will be accomplished. We just need to get the province in order first.
I don't want to sort of lean on experience here, but I think on John A. Macdonald's second go-round as Prime Minister, his first thing was he said, I had no idea what a mess the finances were in. This is something that every government has said since time immemorial.
Justin Trudeau didn't have to say that.
No, well,
he took over was pretty good.
The deficit was,
but let me ask you this, because it was a debate in conservative circles, certainly around the leadership convention, with Doug Ford being sort of the ultimate outsider in all of this. David says, and you may be right, that he is not a populist. That'd be an interesting discussion to have. But is he a conservative?
Oh, absolutely. And he's a conservative who resonates on a common sense level with folks across the political spectrum.
But a classic conservative doesn't necessarily go and promise passenger service up in Northern Ontario again. That's a Liberal thing to do, or an NDP thing to do.
He's a pragmatist, and he's an Ontarian, and he knows that services are important to folks across this province. He's not going to slash and burn things that folks depend on.
So it is it is a populist platform, and it's more than a populist platform. I mean, it is magical thinking, and it was the magic sauce that I think booted it home for the Tories. But now they have a very serious problem because, exactly as we saw, the public expects this to happen. And much of what has been committed by this group, sorry, we're past the 2 weeks, is ridiculous. It's similar to how Christy Clark pulled it off in 2013. When Christy Clark went around in British Columbia in 2013, and her hands would go like this, and she would go, LNG is going to give us $100 billion. Look at the stars between my hands. Ring, $100 billion is going to come magically to British Columbia. We're going to cut your taxes, build your hospitals, build your schools. It's all going to be beautiful. And none of it, of course, happened.
Yeah, and then she was reelected until the Greens and the Democrats made a deal.
So here we have Doug Ford, who, God bless his soul, is not Donald Trump. He is not a vicious bigot. To his credit, he's running on a different playbook.
I don't think he's
what is he
at all, actually.
No, I don't think so. I think actually a beautiful breakthrough among New Canadians. But just look at what he committed to. So 10 cents off the price of gas. The government of Ontario can't deliver that. It can cut its taxes by 10% if it wants and add it to the deficit. But unless you're imposing price controls, I think there's a 50% chance that gas prices will be higher. Cut electricity by an additional 12%. The Liberals, recklessly, are spending net $2 billion a year into the provincial deficit, hidden through a debt trick, to temporarily subsidize electricity rates. And the Conservatives have proposed to add $1 billion to that. With all of this to blow up 3 years from now and what will be a 25 to 30% rate increase. That doesn't add up. And
like the NDP platform where they needed glue sticks to put the right numbers
cut revenue, increase spending, and balance the budget.
So I'm going to say something nice about the Conservative team right now, the Progressive Conservative team. I think one of the very smart moves that Mr. Ford has done is bringing people like Michael onto his team, but people like Jenny Byrne, Corey Tonight, Chris Froggatt. These people have deep experience in actually governing. Again, I don't agree with a lot of their policies, but no one can argue that they don't know how to govern. I hope, and if I speak to them, I'm speaking to you now, I would say the promise to cut 4% across the board is something that I think the public will forgive you for not fulfilling. Because 4% across the board if you just take it out of the health department's budget, is $2.5 billion. I was chief of staff to the Minister of Health for 2.5 years. I know you cannot do that without ravaging healthcare services on the front line. So I'm telling you here today, if Mr. Ford comes out and says, you know what, whatever excuse he uses, the deficit's too high, whatever.
There won't be an excuse. It's not going to be about frontline cuts. You all wasted enough of our money over the last 15 years.
Finish. You know, this promise was reckless. He doesn't have to say that. This promise is not something we can fulfill at this time. I will come out and I will say that that is the right thing to do.
You see, I don't think, I'm sure when that magical moment when Doug Ford adopts Kathleen Wynne's policies and you come out and praise it, you know, I look forward to listening to that on AM 640. You know.
Next Thursday?
You see what I mean about the 2-week rule, right?
I don't think that's all like that. I think that Doug's actually done this and he'll do it again.
Okay. Let's just take a break here for a second. I am painfully aware, because as somebody said, it's 2018, that we tend to be a certain type of person sitting here on the panel.
What's
like
that?
All male. So I am, we've got a few minutes left, I think, Taylor, and we're going to open it up for questions or comments. The only thing is, I know this is a really shy room, so we need somebody to get it going, but if you could keep your comment or question fairly brief so we could get a few in, that would be really...
And I would just say, this is an all-male panel, but one of the positives coming out of this election is we've seen a big boost in the percentage of female members in all the parties, and I think that's something we should all applaud here.
We have a gentleman here.
As a senior with children and grandchildren and so on, I've always been kind of proud of our Canadian system and the politicians. I know we can all throw stones and criticize, but somehow it's always worked. Do you believe that as Canada, or in Ontario now, is it still working and will work? Tom, that's actually for you.
I think that's a very relevant question, and it's one that's been brought into sharp focus, I think, by particularly what's happening south of the border and what's increasingly happening elsewhere in Europe. I think that there is probably, you know, while we're debating left and right, and we didn't even get into the question of what's happened to the center of politics in this province, but I really think that we are entering an age where we are fighting a very different type of political battle. So I think the question is relevant. Are we going to get through it? We're going to get through it better than anybody else. Are we going to get through this? This is just my opinion. Are we going to get through this in a way that resembles the civility that we've had in the past? I don't think so. I think that, you know, what I love about politics in this province, and these three guys are terrific examples of it, is that you can fight hard, you can argue hard, but then everybody goes for a drink afterwards. And if I can have just 20 seconds for a story, you know, back in the days when I was a young reporter at Queen's Park and I was watching a late night debate, and Bill Davis was the premier and Stephen Lewis was the leader of the opposition. And Lewis was in full flight, and in those days when Stephen Lewis came into the House to speak, the galleries filled up because he was such a great orator. So all the benches were filled, the galleries were filled. Lewis had been speaking for about 20 minutes, and then none other than the Premier himself stood up on a point of order. And it was sort of a weird point of order, didn't make any sense. The Speaker couldn't make any hide nor hair of it, ruled the point of order out, and the Premier sat down with a smile on his face. 3 minutes later, Stephen Lewis wrapped up his speech and everybody went home. 2 days later, I bumped into Davis and I said, "Sir, you've got to explain something to me. I don't know why that, you know, what was that point of order thing in Lewis's speech?" He said, "Oh, that." He said, "Well, Stephen and I had a dinner reservation for 8 and I was just letting him know that we're That's what we used to have. I don't think we're there. Anyway, anybody else? There's lots right there. Yes, sir.
Hi, this question's for Michael. Michael, we heard what David said about the mandate that the Ontarians gave your party, but I'd like to hear from you and maybe the team, the Conservative team. What mandate do you believe you received from the Ontario people in terms of what issues that you think you need to move on?
Well, I think number one, and one of the first orders of business, getting out of cap and trade and fighting the federal government on a carbon tax. Wow, you don't get that much. That's good. So I'd say number one would be that, and restoring fiscal sanity to this province would be the other. So I think you're going to see those are going to be the two places where it's very near to the Premier Designate's heart. It's something that he focused on with his brother at Toronto City Hall, and I think that's what we're going to see be the most important thing at Queen's Park.
Anybody else? Right over here.
Thanks very much. I guess this is for all three, but mostly for our progressive conservative colleague. I'm interested to know how you're going to engage citizens and in the healthcare area, patient representatives and patients moving forward in making your decisions in areas that are relevant to particular groups. I think this has been something we've fell by the wayside over time in this province, and I think we feel that we haven't been listened to often, and we've been just told what's good for us. How are you going to make sure that we're working with you to let you know what's good for us?
So throughout the election and the leadership, Doug continuously, the Premier Designate continuously talked about the need to consult the most impacted stakeholders, and in healthcare, that's obviously patients and families and frontline workers. So I think you'll see a high reliance on the expertise from those who live within the system, work within the system, and are the face, not paper pushers.
Anybody else want to get in on that? Yeah.
So look, from the perspective of the New Democrats, there's a lesson to learn from the experience of the last 5 years in Ottawa, and that is that the challenge function that you acquire in Parliament when you're official opposition can't be all you do. And actually, in your question is the other half of the job, which is official opposition, whose job is to provide an alternative to the government, is going to have to work really, really hard all across the province to be like that, with where the public is coming from and the government. I think, I joked in a previous panel that I did, I think this government is going to be a target-rich environment. And the trick is going to be to not miss that opportunity, and that's not just about asking questions that the media like in question period. The public doesn't care about that. It's to stay close to the public and be speaking about what they care about as they understand where this government's going. Cut taxes, increase spending, balance the budget does not add up. That's going to play itself out in the next 2 to 3 years, and then they're going to be looking for something better.
So just to the question on working with patients and patient groups, I take solace in the fact that Christine Elliott has been elected as a member of provincial parliament. I had the pleasure of working with her when she was the patient ombudsperson or ombudsman for the province of Ontario. I think, whatever portfolio she has, I assume she's going to have a cabinet portfolio. I'm not going to presume what that will be, but I hope and I believe that around that cabinet table, somebody like Christine will be a real advocate for really continuing a patient-centered approach to healthcare in this province. See, I can say nice things about it.
I was worried there for a minute. Anyway, David.
A lot of the discussion tonight has been about tactics, but I want to ask a question about substance, because there was hardly any of it in the election campaign. I've looked at 3 economic forecasts recently for Canada. Next 3 years, we never get above 2%. That's a huge constraint on what governments can do. Secondly, we have a big deficit. We've promised to deal with that. Thirdly, we have an aging society, which means rising healthcare costs. Fourthly, we have massive population growth occurring over the next 20 years in southwestern Ontario, including the GTA, which will require massive investments. The government has promised to cut taxes in spite of all of this and to deliver on this. I don't see how this computes. How can you meet public services and continue to have tax cuts? Every political party seems to feel that it has to have tax cuts in its program. The costs are going to go up. Building a better society in southern Ontario, healthcare, dealing with the deficit. I haven't even mentioned climate change. One little sign of that is what's happening with Lyme disease across this province. I know of 2 cases now where people have suffered permanent neurological damage, which constrains the rest of their life because ticks are coming in here due to the changing climate. To laugh at climate change and say we do nothing is irresponsible. We need governments that govern for the future, not in political parties that just play in short-term tactics.
Okay, thanks very much.
I'm not sure if there's a question in there. One,
well,
I don't think you can change the temperature or control ticks by bringing in a tax, number one. Number two, the voters wanted the tax cuts. That's why they voted for us. That's what David's number said. It's their money, and the government should work for them, not for other interests. So this was... leadership is absolutely doing what the will of the electorate is.
So you've promised fiscal sanity.
Reining and spending, absolutely.
Like,
a 4%.
In 4 years?
4%. It will depend how bad things are. We're not going to harm people. We will not harm people, but we have to get a handle on that first.
Let's just talk about this one a bit more. This is a very interesting question. It's actually, I think that's the heart of the challenge facing the province of Ontario in the next 4 years, that question that you just asked. Let's begin by saying there's no question this jurisdiction is heavily indebted. There was a time when the Conservatives cared about that. There's a serious fiscal challenge. Now it's manageable, but it is a serious debt pile that needs to be managed. There's no question about it. And so, and I'm speaking strictly for myself here, we're all just hearing from us here. I think it can be argued fiscally and economically for the reasons you just said. A tax cut for the people who need help the least is the last thing the province needs. And by the way, a majority of the people of Ontario didn't vote for it, bearing in mind we're in the system that we're in. So the root of it is quite right, and I think the nostrums that the government are offering, which don't add up, are not going to make anything better. In fact, in many ways, I think what we will end up with is an Ontario that looks the way Toronto did after Ford Nation was running Toronto, which is going to be a whole bunch of wasted time where nothing much happens, a bunch of money gets spent to no good effect, and then we're going to have to start again from scratch. Right? The issues that you've talked about are the heart of the matter. And this government has no answer to it. It is essentially just playing with magical thinking. It worked beautifully, but it solves no problems.
Okay. So that's a good point. This government
very
has
quickly, Omar, because
and look, I am willing to give, as I said before, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt because I do think there's a lot of smart people there. A couple of things I'll say just on the global economic trends. We are seeing tightening for sure. We're going to see more likely, especially if the Americans come in with 25% across the board tariff on auto imports. To the Kathleen Wynne economic record. So look, I know the campaign is over, but these are facts. Under Kathleen Wynne, we actually did have the highest rate of economic growth above and beyond the G7 average for 4 years.
Omar, can I suggest this?
It is true.
I'm going to cut you off. If anybody would like to hear about the record of Kathleen Wynne, if you meet in the back of the room afterwards, I think we've had a lot of time to do it, but there is one more participant I want to get on here. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
And this can be very short from each of you. Calculating all the factors that were at play leading into June 7th, if there was one thing, if you were a master puppeteer and you could change to garner greater support, what would it be in one sentence?
We just started the other end.
No, you go for it.
Now
okay. We would have talked about getting out of cap and trade even more, I think, because both David's numbers and the lack of attacks that we received on it confirmed that we were hugely on the side of the public on that one.
Right.
I'll go next.
Well, look, if the question is what could we change in the election, is that your question? So I would wish for 6 more points from the blue guys, right? And what that required was to make a more compelling case to folks who had never voted for the Democrats before. And so essentially that's the mission of the next 4 years, is going to be to hold what you got and just get the last 5% that brings you over the top. And that's going to be a combination of what people make of the record of the government and what they think of the forward offer that the Democrats will make.
So, I talked earlier about how we lost the middle class across the board. I wish we could have talked about some of our policies that would have directly benefited people in the middle class, like free preschool, like free tuition, less in a deputy minister policy wonk type of way that everyone in this room appreciates, I know, but more in a way that my father-in-law, who's a small business owner, new Canadian from Turkey, would be able to understand and appreciate. I'll leave that for the communications experts to come give me advice on later.
We've set some sort of record here tonight, is that we've had a terrific political discussion and I believe not once did anybody bring up Donald Trump, which is incredible, and especially as we go forward, every politician I've met who has been elected starts off as a regionalist or a nationalist, ends up being an internationalist by the end because of the nature of the job. Doug Ford is going to have to learn how to deal with Donald Trump and everything that happens south of the U.S.
And Donald Trump will have to learn to deal with Doug Ford.
I don't think he really...
For the people.
There you go. Welcome to Ford Nation.
I'm not sure he cares.
Welcome. The passports are in the mail.
So,
it's going to be a great 4 years.
On that rather bizarre note, I'm going to thank Michael, Omar, and Brian. Great discussion. Thank you all very much. It was great.
Good job. Nice to meet you.
Congrats on the campaign.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll see you this summer.
Thank you, Tom. So I alluded to earlier, if I can just keep your attention for a few more minutes. I am in the waning hours of my presidency, and it seems to me there's little point in holding this podium if one doesn't put it to effect on occasion. So I would just ask all of our panelists to remember the environment in the months ahead. That would be my request. I'd like now to call upon Chris Loretto, Principal at Strategy Corp, to thank our panelists. Chris?
Well, I'm so glad we picked the hottest day of the year to do tonight's presentation. I literally just finished drying off and now I'm all wet again. So, but sincerely, thank you to everybody who came out tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank our panelists for relitigating the election, but actually for providing the insights. And I do want to say to all three of you, good on you for being involved in the central campaigns, everybody in this room who was involved in the democratic process some less than 2 weeks ago. You should be commended, and we should be encouraging more people in our neighborhoods to get involved in the process, regardless of what party that they support. Congratulations to the Tories. Congratulations to the New Democrats on forming official opposition. The Liberals are never down and out. Good luck with the rebuilding of the party. As a Conservative who was there in '93, that was my first membership. It's a long road, but it should be a rewarding one to get you back to being a strong party in our system. Tom, thank you as always for great moderation. And on behalf of Strategy Corp, again, thank you everybody. Drive safely. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
At the Empire Club, we pride ourselves on bringing rich discussion like this to our podium. Hello. A little commercial for the sponsors, because without them we wouldn't have had tonight. Thank you to the Toronto Real Estate Board, OMERS and Strategy Corporation for making the event possible. I also want to thank MediaEvents.ca for once again taking our discussion to a wider audience through their podcasts. Follow us on social media. And finally, I'm hoping to see you all tomorrow at our final event of the season, Blockchain Revolution, featuring Don Tapscott. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and for your support. I made it.